What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here, and back to review Christopher Nolan's much anticipated and already hotly debated adaptation of Homer's The Odyssey. It's almost like a battle between several armies, some of whom are Christopher Nolan fanatics, some of whom are history and mythology buffs, some are just opposing sides in the ongoing culture war. But with my review, I'm going to try and speak on behalf of an audience that have been a part of my entire life. The fantasy nerds, the junkies for tales of sword and sorcery, especially Greek mythology. And from that angle, I have to say this movie both hits and misses the target in equal measure. Some ingredients are incredibly impressive and impossible to deny, while others are insanely frustrating and disappointing, and I'm going to do my best with this video to call attention to all of the above. And if you decide to stick with me but have not yet seen the movie, I should warn you I'll be making frequent references to the original text, which I have right here, so if you don't want any spoilers, this might not be the video for you. But what I can say is about half of my audience seemed restless and they were screwing around their phones, while the other half gave the movie thunderous applause. I wasn't really in either camp. I had no trouble getting into the movie and staying engaged throughout its running time. But I should add, the first 5 or 10 minutes will put you to the test because it features some of the worst acting and some of the worst writing from the entire movie. Why would you start this big, giant, 3-hour mythological extravaganza with the weakest scenes by far in the movies? But more on that in a second. But I'd also heard in advance that the climax of the movie was the best part of the movie and that it was going to knock my socks off, but it didn't. I've seen other adaptations of the text that nailed the ending in far superior fashion with about 1/100th the resources, which I get into in a video that I should go ahead and plug now, where I count down my top 10 favorite Greek mythology movies. But I'm going to make you wait until the end of this video before telling you whether or not Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey forced me to rearrange either my top 10 or my top 5, but I'll include a link to that video in the description below. But in spite of some of my lingering frustrations with both the beginning as well as the ending of the movie, there are some other scenes and other beats scattered throughout Nolan's film where I could not deny that he was cooking something very interesting in the oven. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. And let's start with the initial bad impression that was made in the first few scenes. And for those of you who need a quick review on what the official synopsis for The Odyssey is, here is the official premise as written over on IMDb. After the Trojan War, Odysseus faces a dangerous voyage back to Ithaca, meeting creatures like the Cyclops, Polyphemus, Sirens, and Calypso along the way. Holy smokes. People have been talking about this story and reading this story and reenacting it and like staging it for like 2,700 years, and that was the best they could come up with for IMDb. But let's not criticize whoever wrote the synopsis for IMDb. Let's keep our criticisms limited to the movie because it starts off from the point of view of Telemachus, who's played by Tom Holland. And I love and adore Tom Holland as Peter Parker, and I think he makes one hell of a Spider-Man. But if there were ever a movie that revealed his very narrow, limited acting range, it is The Odyssey. And initially, throughout the first 5 or 10 minutes of the movie, he's having to carry the entire weight of the movie on his shoulders, almost like Atlas, the Titan in Greek mythology, has to carry the weight of the sky on his shoulders. And Tom Holland, unless he's in a suit that's very red and very blue, I don't think he's got the chops to carry a movie, especially a big, giant Christopher Nolan movie, because his acting, admittedly, they're giving him terrible dialogue, but I think the terrible dialogue sounds much worse due to Tom Holland's delivery style. And everybody's been criticizing the overuse of words like dad and mom and daddy for months now after all the trailers got dropped in our laps. But almost every single use of those words is in the first couple minutes of the movie. It's like, just stop saying daddy and mommy and mama and dada and poo-poo and goo-goo gaga. Stop it with all the modern baby talk and just try to give us a little bit of antiquity, because people have been talking about the modern sounding dialogue throughout, and everybody's kind of using whatever accent they use and whatever country they come from for this movie. So it's just basically a big kind of broad, bland, generic accent that's used across the board. But the reality is, almost all the horrible dialogue, you kind of get it out of the way in the first couple of scenes, and then you can just relax and enjoy the movie. But if, hypothetically, Christopher Nolan had wanted to go in a different direction when it came to the dialogue, emphasizing antiquity instead of modernity, I would have said get your hands on the Robert Fagles translation of The Odyssey and basically just rip every line of dialogue straight from that text. But I'm very biased because I read that translation in high school and I read it in college, but that was a long time ago. But recently I listened to the audio fiction read by fucking Sir Ian McKellen himself, Gandalf, reading the Robert Fagles translation. And there's something about having Ian McKellen deliver that dialogue and deliver that prose and deliver that poetry where it's every line is it just sings. It's like music. You're like, oh my God, this is this. It is the best version of the Odyssey that we will ever have. So, while there have been many movies that have sampled part of or all of the text of the Odyssey, in the end, the best version of the Odyssey you can get your hands on, apart from just reading the original Homeric Greek poem verse from 2,700 years ago, I would recommend the Robert Fagles translation. But let's say Christopher Nolan wanted to go even deeper What if, hypothetically, they had found a way to do the entire movie like in Homeric Greek, like whatever the equivalent of the Greek language was 2,700 years ago when Homer was around. If Homer was even a real guy or just a couple different people, but he was around about 700 BC. But imagine if the entire movie had been done in some ancient form of Greek with subtitles. Boom! What one major scandal or one major controversy surrounding the movie could have been thrown totally out the window. And also, it would have allowed Christopher Nolan to use subtitles throughout the entire movie, which would allow people to appreciate the dialogue, much of which is inaudible in this movie. People pointed this out in Tenet, but in some of Christopher Nolan's movies, you can't understand what people are saying. You're like, well, the visuals are astonishing and the actors are cool, but what the fuck are people talking about? Like the sailing scene in Tenet, where you're like, there's no way we're supposed to understand what they're saying. There's a lot of dialogue in this movie where you can tell they're like, you know what, we're done with the sound mix. Let's just move on. Let's do another scene. But if they'd done the entire movie in some sort of ancient form of the Greek language, then they could have given subtitles to the entire film and also kill two birds with one stone. But I've been talking a lot of trash about this movie so far, so let's hit that tennis ball back to the other side of the court and offer this movie a little bit of praise. What I found really interesting about it was that in two scenes, Christopher Nolan shows us a side of his filmmaking style and technique that we'd never seen before. He almost kind of veers into the horror genre, which I'm totally down to see, because anytime you have a really successful filmmaker with a very recognizable signature style that has worked many times in the past, it's hard to see them venture into new terrain where they might take some risks. But because Nolan's going into the world of mythology and the supernatural with monsters and witches and that sort of thing, he did have to get outside of his comfort zone. And on two occasions, I thought he almost completely, totally pulled it off the way I would want to see it in my imagination. He has his own take or his own version or his own interpretation, which is lacking a lot of the dialogue from the text that I like. But at least visually, they were really cool. So we have the Cyclops Polyphemus, and once again, I'm never quite sure if I'm pronouncing names even remotely correctly. When you've been reading a name on the page for decades but never saying it out loud, you're like, am I just saying it like a 5-year-old child, or is this how you're supposed to say it? But the Cyclops, who captures a lot of Odysseus' men and starts eating them one at a time, at least the way the Cyclops looked and the way he ate people, is like, yeah, it's pretty gruesome. What the scene was missing was all the clever dialogue going back and forth between Odysseus and the Cyclops, because it's a little bit like that scene in The Hobbit where Bilbo's taunting Smaug as he's basically looking for a weak spot in his armor. But when you have somebody who's totally helpless, all they have are their wits. And Odysseus is famous for his cunning sense of strategy, his wisdom, his knowledge. And in the original text, there's a great play on words where he offers fawning flattery, and they're making wine from him. And basically, there's this elaborate seduction before they finally poke out his eye and get a chance to escape. That's pretty much all missing because, for whatever reason, Christopher Nolan didn't want to include any of the scenes where Odysseus does something clever. People constantly talk about how he's clever, but we very rarely do we see it. But at least in terms of the atmosphere in that cave and lighting everything by fire and people getting yanked into the shadows, that scene was cool. But the scene with Circe, the witch who ensnares some of Odysseus' men and transforms them into pigs, that was gnarly, because it's not as simple or cut and dry as we've seen in some other movies where people drink a potion or eat something bad and they turn into something. It's a slow, painful, gradual transformation where the actress playing Circe, Samantha Morton, is getting involved and manipulating these men almost like clay. I was like, whoa! People think of Nolan as being so kind of cold and clinical and distant, and he's almost got a mathematical objectivity at times. But in this scene, you can tell the filmmakers really rolled up their sleeves and all right, bring out the lube and any sort of slimy substance we have on set. We're just going to cover every actor and every prop with all this crap, and we're going to have these people actually transform into pigs right before our eyes. And it was disgusting. I was like, all right, Nolan, I've never seen anything like this before in any of your movies. Bravo, take a bow. And when it comes to practical effects, we live in an era where all we see are computerized, digitized, or AI lousy effects that just feel interchangeable and bland and predictable, like basically every movie coming out of the Disney factory. But here we have arguably the world's most popular filmmaker, the world's most successful filmmaker, showing off the allure of practical effects. And so, yeah, bravo. The scene with Circe was really good. So I've criticized the movie and I've praised the movie. Now let's offer a little commentary that's kind of like lukewarm water, somewhere right in between. Matt Damon as Odysseus. I've seen other actors play Odysseus in a lot of other movies. I mean, in Troy, he was played by Sean Bean. In Ulysses, he's played by Kirk Douglas. In The Return, he's played by Ray Fiennes. I can't remember who plays him in the animated version in Ulysses 31, but if you've never seen Ulysses 31 and you like anime, definitely check out Ulysses 31. It's got a groovy theme song. Ulysses. Who else has played him? There's the version of Helen of Troy from the 1920s, which is like this giant 4-hour saga for all the silent film buffs out there. I can't remember which actor played the Odysseus, but long story short, a lot of people have played him over the years. Kirk Douglas is my favorite Odysseus, but he's Ulysses because they go with all the Italian or the Roman names in that interpretation of the film. Ray Fiennes is my second favorite Odysseus, and I must admit, the climax of this movie, which everybody told me was so awe-inspiring and so thunderous and so exhilarating, I think was done better in The Return. Maybe not the battle with the Suitors, but the scene where Odysseus finally proves who he is by stringing his bow and firing the arrow through the 12 axe heads. All right, I know I was going to say this was going to be like the part where I say some lukewarm commentary, but we're going to veer back into a criticism because maybe the biggest flaw of this film is only going to bother diehard mythology nerds or history nerds, but the big test that Penelope offers to all the suitors at the end is whoever can string my husband's bow and fire an arrow through 12 axe heads, he wins the contest. I'm going to marry him. And I remember when I was a freshman in high school, we were like, how do you fire an arrow through axe heads? And our teacher gave us these drawings on the wall, these diagrams showing how it could be done. Like, there's two different ways. Imagine an axe head sideways where just through the decoration, you have a gap or an opening. Or, as my freshman year English teacher taught me, imagine if you turn all the axe blades sideways and you have the hole that basically the handle would go through, the wooden handle would go into, which would create an even more narrow opening. But people have been debating how this is done or how it's portrayed probably since this poem was first created, thousands of years ago. But the way Christopher Nolan decided to do it, I was like, this is by far the worst imaginable, because instead of 12 axe heads in a row, he has 12 axes that are kind of laced side by side, like across each other, creating these little gaps. You have to fire the arrows. So I was like, this is the dumbest interpretation of the text I've ever fucking seen. And it's not even that hard. It's like a big old opening. Luckily, the suitors were unable to string the bow. So when Odysseus finally strings the bow, he just fires it through, no problem. But it's like that. Anyway, that drove me fucking crazy. And it's a nerdy technical detail from mythology. But it's almost like Christopher Nolan is assuming that the audience is too thick or too slow or too unsophisticated to understand the myth as written. So he's trying to dumb it down. And I think that's also why he went with the modern dialogue. He just had a movie about atomic energy, gross $1 billion and win all the Oscars in the world. Maybe trust the audience that loves your movies to have like at least a modicum of intelligence and sophistication and the ability to understand the myth as written. And furthermore, while Odysseus is definitely not the most badass warrior in all of Greek mythology, I mean, you've got characters like Heracles and Achilles and all these legendary figures that are stronger, bigger, faster, etc. and so forth. But Odysseus is known for strategy, and he's known for being a badass archer. Once again, he's the only person who can string that bow. And yet, throughout this movie, anytime Matt Damon strings a bow and fires it, he almost does it like he doesn't even give a shit. It's like, dude, being a great archer is kind of what Odysseus is known for. And he kind of just like shoot from the hip without even really pulling the string back that far. And he doesn't even seem like he's really aiming. It's like, I expect like some Robin Hood level gravitas where like the camera zooms in and we get like, like a crazy perspective, like his eye down the arrow and really showing like this superb marksmanship. But Matt Damon's just kind of like, doing, doing. It's like, dude, you're not even like trying to hit anything. Like, well, anyway, once again, it's a nerdy detail, but I feel like if you have a hero that's known for being really good with a weapon, put all your emphasis on that as much as humanly possible to show what a badass they are when they're firing arrows. And so that was very frustrating as well. But in the end, Matt Damon was fine. I think a lot of people, ever since Team America, and they portrayed him as the guy going, Matt Damon, everybody's been imitating him like that for like more than 20 years. I'm sure at some point he's like I'm an Oscar-winning screenwriter. Like, go fuck yourselves. But I don't really have any criticisms for Damon apart from just the clumsy stuff with the bow and arrow and the clumsy stuff with the axe head. So what should we talk about next? Something good or something bad? Let me glance at my notes. All right, let's talk about armor. I will not claim to be an armor buff. I will not claim to be a history buff. If you were to say, when does the Bronze Age begin and end versus when does the Iron Age begin and end, I'd be like, whoa, I would get on shaky terrain very quickly without the assistance of a laptop by my side. But you can definitely tell when armor's coming from different periods or from different design points of view. And it seems like when it comes to Christopher Nolan and his approach to this movie, there are some areas where he's absolutely hell-bent upon making it appear like a story that might have been told or created, 2,700 years ago, where it's like really bare bones and primitive and that sort of thing. And yet, there are two big scenes where the armor is just totally absurd. Like, I think Odysseus, his armor looks pretty cool. I know some people object to the helmet style and that sort of thing, but overall, he just looks like a hero from the Bronze Age. But Agamemnon, who's played horribly by Benny Safdie, he's easily one of the weakest performances in the movie. But it doesn't help that he's wearing this suit of armor that's so bulky he can't even move. Like, there's a scene where they're invading Troy and attacking, like the gates are open and he's standing there and you can tell he's not moving or charging with his friends because he literally, he's like Darth Vader if you unplugged him. Like, he can't move in that fucking armor. It looks ridiculous. People were comparing it to like something that you would see in the Dark Knight trilogy. And I agree. It seems totally out of place. It doesn't seem to have come from any point of the last 2,700 years. If anything, if you're doing like a futuristic sci-fi version of the Iliad and the Odyssey, that would be the armor you go with for Agamemnon. So that was frustrating. But there are a couple of other scenes where the armor just looks really, really bizarre. Like, a lot of people have pointed out online in advance. There's a scene where Telemachus and Menelaus go hunting, and like the wardrobe they're wearing, it looks like something you would see like in the Amazon show, Lord of the Rings of Power, where it's like, they look like costumes you could buy off the rack at a drugstore. And speaking of which, the armor worn by the Trojans during the flashback scenes to the Trojan War also look ridiculous. But the most funky armor by far is the armor worn by the Lastrygonians, if I'm saying their name correctly. In the story, at one point, they land on this island that is ruled over by these giant cannibalistic savages. Like, they're huge, like 12 feet tall, and they eat people. And Odysseus' men are basically, they repeat the line from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, like, run away, and they haul ass. And most of their ships get completely destroyed and sank or sunk. I don't know grammatically how I should conjugate the verb, but their ships get destroyed, the men get eaten. But in this movie, they bump into this little kid in the woods, and he's wearing this armor that looks like it would be designed around like the year 13 or 1400 AD, like really like ornate full-plate armor that you might see like in the Tower of London now. And there's a great room where they have all these different suits of armor from different periods. Or it looks like a suit of armor designed for the movie Excalibur, like R.I.P. Tony Stello, but he used to justifiably point out, as much as people love the movie Excalibur, the armor is just like a thing of like fantasy. It's like, it's just plucked out of the human imagination. It has nothing to do with the Dark Ages. And suddenly in this scene in the Odyssey, we have all these giants charging towards Odysseus' men wearing this borderline kind of futuristic looking full plate armor that might be cool in a game like Dark Souls or Elden Ring, but it clashes with the historical tone or the depiction of the armor as worn by Odysseus' men. So the Lastrygonians, they probably would have been just as cool, if not more so, in the movie if they just were like, giants with like, fur bikinis or whatever, charging out of the woods and eating Odysseus' men. But yeah, it's one of those things where if you're gonna make a huge emphasis on like the score, and I thought the score was pretty cool, but they didn't use any instruments which did not exist at the time that the story was originally written. It's like, all right, that's kind of an interesting creative approach. But if you're not going to apply that philosophy equally throughout the entire movie, well, then why make such a big deal out of it? If your ingredients are all going to be kind of a hodgepodge from different eras and different influences, well, then it doesn't really matter if you're choosing to make that kind of if you're putting those creative handcuffs on when it comes to the score. But let's take a break from bashing the movie and offer it a little praise. As I was watching the movie, I kept sitting back and just kind of luxuriating in the fact that here we have the world's most popular filmmaker at least making the attempt at a 3-hour mythological historical epic, however you want to describe it, where almost all of it involves living, breathing actors on a set, on a location, with props. And that sounds like, it's like, oh, well, that's the bare minimum. But compare that to other big budget movies these days, where basically it's just an animated movie where you have a lot of actors standing around on sound stages in front of green screens, and you have a lot of designers coming in after the fact and creating the background and creating the other characters they're interacting with. And you could tell Nolan was trying to capture as much of this movie as humanly possible in the camera. He's trying to create an immersive experience where you really felt like you were in a different time period and in a mythological era, kind of like an age of pre-antiquity. And the only scene I can think of where you see any real CGI creatures is during one of the famous challenges that Odysseus and his men have to face, where they have an option. They can try to avoid a whirlpool, or they can try to avoid a cliff where there's this horrible monster, but you cannot go straight through the middle. You're either going to get sucked into the whirlpool and lose everybody, or you're going to have to decide, all right, we can live without 6 of our men, and we're going to go by this cliff. And that creature's name, throughout all my life, I've been calling it Scylla. I don't know if it's Scylla or Scylla. It's Scylla. They say it in the movie, but I've already forgotten how they pronounce it in the film. And the whirlpool's called Charybdis. Anyway, I'm sure I'm fucking both of this up. Anyway, there's a horrible choice that must be made. But the creature, Scylla, whatever the hell it's called, that's a CGI creature. But it's done in such a way where you never really see the whole creature. Like, they're sailing by the cliffs, and these tentacles are coming down and yank people up. But because it's like a blink and you'll miss it moment, you never really get the sense like, oh, this is a big, stupid CGI monster that's clashing with the rest of the environment. And it almost completely works. Maybe not totally, but at least they were trying to use CGI to a minimum degree where it wouldn't overall distort the overall tone and flavor and style of the movie. And think, off the top of your head, how many filmmakers are there alive who could actually attempt even to make a movie like that on that scale? Once upon a time, people like Cecil B. DeMille would make these movies all the time, or Anthony Mann would make movies like Fall of the Roman Empire. Or guys like David Lean would make movies like Dr. Zhivago or Lawrence of Arabia. But we're talking about people who are making movies in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. It's more or less a lost art form. But of all the filmmakers alive today who have both the commercial clout as well as the artistic clout and the awards clout that can mount a production like this, it's really... Christopher Nolan is the guy, and so I guess the fun of this movie is going to be debating what he got right, and what he got wrong. But we should just take a moment to pause and appreciate the fact at least he made the attempt. He took a big giant swing. I disagree with a lot of his creative decisions, but at least he's making those decisions and offering his own interpretation on the text. A lot of other filmmakers out there are like, oh, we'll just do another version of Ghostbusters, or we'll do another version of Predator, or we'll do another version of RoboCop. It's like, no! Try to do something amazing. And admittedly, the Odyssey's been done before. It's even been done in superior fashion on several occasions. Even the comedy, O Brother, Where Art Thou?, which is barely an adaptation of the Odyssey, is vastly superior to the Odyssey. But something that's this old and this grandiose and just this classic, it's hard to think of it as like a franchise. If a story's lasted for millennia, it's outgrown the notion of being IP or a franchise, and this is obviously just a fresh adaptation of an ancient text. But having now said all those nice things about Christopher Nolan and how he's really in a class of his own when it comes to his filmography and his soaring ambition, some people might argue Denis Villeneuve. I think if and when Denis Villeneuve has made many more movies as good as Dune Part 1 and 2, well, then he will be you can mention him in the same breath with Christopher Nolan. But I feel like he's still on his way to trying to be in that upper echelon of Hall of Fame directors. But having now said all those nice things about Christopher Nolan, I've got 2 big complaints about his interpretation of the text, one of which is very obvious. People keep talking about Elliot Page playing the character of Sinon, and the story of Sinon is not in the Odyssey. If you go flipping through all the pages, where's Sinon? Look, I'm looking for Sinon. You're not going to find Sinon here, because the story of Sinon was fleshed out in other plays, other poems, other stories, probably the biggest example of which is the Aeneid. And my dad read the Aeneid back in college. He loves the Aeneid, but the Aeneid was written by Virgil, and the story of the Aeneid is basically about one of the lone survivors of Troy who helps found the city of Rome, which then becomes the Roman Empire, etc. and so forth. But it's believed that Virgil wrote the Aeneid sometime around 30 to 19 BC, many hundreds of years after the time of Homer. Whether Homer was an individual or several people, but Homer was around 700 BC. Virgil was around many centuries later. And so the fact that Nolan took the story of Sinon and now has inserted it into the Odyssey, it just seems like when you're adapting a giant text, more often than not into a movie, you're gonna have to just start cutting out big chunks that there's not enough room in a 3-hour movie to include all that text. I mean, just the audiobook alone, I think it's 17 or 18 hours long. It's a big giant story. Not everything can make it into a feature film. So if you're already cutting stuff that's there from the Odyssey, why would you then create room for a story and a character which doesn't even originally come from the Odyssey? So just as a purist for the Odyssey, that annoyed me. And I just want to tell Christopher Nolan, if you want to tell the story of Sinon, well then adapt Virgil's The Aeneid into a feature film. My dad would be thrilled. Every time I talk about the Iliad and the Odyssey, he's like, but what about the Aeneid? I'm like, yep, it wasn't written by the same guy. It was written many years later. But anyway, for my dad, it's like this giant trilogy, and he doesn't really care who wrote what. He just knows that one person from Troy helped found Rome in the Aeneid, so it all kind of goes together. In any case, my attitude is, if Christopher Nolan wanted to tell the story of Sinon, well, then do the story of Sinon as it was written in other stories. But my biggest lingering complaint about the overall tone of this movie, and basically Christopher Nolan's approach to the story specifically, he seems to regard the entire saga of the Odyssey as punishment for Odysseus and his men breaking the law of Zeus in terms of how they sacked the city of Troy. And stick with me for a second, because I'm going to have to make a long point, but I promise you there will be a point. But in this movie, they're constantly talking about the law of Zeus. And it basically boils down to the law of hospitality, where if a stranger shows up at your door, give them a glass of wine, give them a meal, because you never know, it might be a god in disguise. And they'll punish you if you do not show them good hospitality. And you can just tell how, like, a lot of Greek myths were all about, like, there are great cautionary tales or fables about how to behave towards your fellow beings. So that law of Zeus is, like, people mention it constantly throughout this movie. Anytime somebody misbehaves, like, oh, you're breaking the law of Zeus, you should be nice to this beggar, asking for, a bowl of soup, etc., and so forth. But the way this movie tries to set up or tries to interpret the fall of Troy is that by virtue of the fact that Odysseus came up with this plan of the Trojan horse and tricked the Trojans into allowing them into the city so they could open the gates, they basically said he, with that action, broke the law of Zeus, because as the guest of Troy, you shouldn't burn the city to the ground and kill everybody. But my attitude is they were not guests. There's nothing about hospitality involved in that at all, because the Trojans weren't bringing in guests. The Trojans saw what they thought was a giant offering to the gods. And like, oh, well, it's beautiful and it's probably valuable. Let's bring it into our city and we'll make it our own. And so when the Greeks came out, it was just a tricky strategy. Like, if you're on a battlefield and you have different, forces like that are trying to outmaneuver one another, if one side or the other successfully out-strategizes or outmaneuvers the other side, you're not breaking anything. You're just being a successful tactician or strategist. And Nolan takes this one step further, because throughout the movie, we constantly hear these references to these mysterious people of the sea who've been invading all these cities that are along the coastline. And we hear about it in Sparta, and we hear about it in Ithaca, and we hear about it in different places. And I was like, I don't know who these people of the sea are, but they're definitely not mentioned in the Odyssey. Are you trying to tease the inevitable wars like that we saw like in 300? Or what are you talking about? But as it turns out in this movie, the people of the sea are the Greeks returning home. But because they did this horrible, unjust act by sacking the city of Troy in an underhanded way, they've basically lost touch with like their Greek culture and who they are. And they've lost touch with the law of Zeus. And they've basically now have become like uncivilized barbarians, sacking and plundering and murdering and raping their way home and that sort of thing. And I was like, you are wildly reinterpreting and the entire text of the Odyssey and looking at it in a different light, because in Greek mythology, whether you're talking about like the wars of the gods and the Titans, or as late as like the Iliad or the Odyssey, when people do something bad, they're either punished immediately or punished slowly, but the gods will find a way to punish them very quickly, because once again, most myths are simple tales of morality, teaching you a lesson of some kind. Every great story about a hero or every great story about a god, usually there's a lesson about like codes of conduct that you can kind of take with you to live a better life. And in the context of the Odyssey, Odysseus is punished for his vanity when he blinds and then taunts Polyphemus, Poseidon's son, as they're sailing away. Odysseus gets very proud and gets very boastful, and he starts. Initially, he told the Cyclops, "My name is Nobody," so that when the Cyclops is calling for help, everyone's like, "Well, who's killing you?" He's like, "Nobody's killing me," and so the other Cyclops leave him alone. But as he's sailing away, Odysseus taunts him by saying who he truly is, and at that point, Polyphemus curses him and begs his father Poseidon to make it difficult for Odysseus to get home. And because Poseidon's the god of the sea, he makes it very, very difficult for Odysseus to get home. But Odysseus was proud, he was arrogant, he was boastful, and he gets punished. Like, that is why it takes him so long to get home. It's not something where the entire Greek culture is being condemned for breaking the law of Zeus through winning the war in an underhanded fashion. So that really annoyed me. And it's just like, if you're adapting something that's stuck around for many thousands of years or several thousand years, maybe just trust the text. Trust the qualities that have made it endure. Trust the qualities that make teachers still want to teach it. Trust the qualities that make people still want to do fresh translations or make movies or animation or video games or whatever. But when you start reinterpreting and changing the message of the text, that's when I start pushing back. And I think what it boils down to, and this is just a theory on my part, but I suspect deep down on a gut level, I don't know if Christopher Nolan actually enjoys Greek myths. He might find them fascinating from a historical standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, but when people grow up reading Greek mythology or discover it in high school through like the classic Greek tragedies, or get into reading all the great epic tales of the heroes, like all the great tales of high adventure, usually like the real thrill of them is fortune and glory, like gaining like mythical magical items that can do incredible things, or achieving great deeds, like killing the big bad monster, getting the hot princess, and then creating like a lineage of heroes that come after you that rule over a kingdom for centuries to come. Like fortune and glory all the way. And you constantly hear about it in the Iliad, or people are going over there, not necessarily because Helen's been abducted, but they see it as an opportunity for great glory. They want to be a part of the biggest thing to happen to their culture ever, and like they don't want to miss out on all the action. So the accumulation of glory is a huge part of what drives them. But never at any point throughout this entire movie's running time did I get the sense that Christopher Nolan was getting off on the great deeds committed by all these larger than life characters. Because when you're reading the Iliad, and you're reading about, like the incredibly tempestuous relationship between Agamemnon and Achilles, and how they're basically at war with each other over this one woman, and Achilles is refusing to fight, and Agamemnon can't win without him, and all this stuff, and then Hector's starting to kick all kinds of ass and driving the Greeks further and further back. Like, you are getting off on the spectacle, like the bloodlust and all that. These are tales of courage and great deeds, and you can tell they are from the time in which they were written. But obviously it was a warlike time where everybody, if you weren't from the same town, most likely you were at war with all your neighbors. And I never got the sense that Christopher Nolan was like reveling in like the thunder of Zeus. Like, you occasionally hear thunder, which maybe it's Zeus, maybe it's not, but you don't see Zeus. But I feel like a real fantasy nerd would show Zeus, or make it a little bit more explicit, or they would show Poseidon beneath the ocean, creating all these tidal waves that are like ruining Odysseus' men. Nolan keeps trying to ground it. Even Athena, played by Zendaya, who's constantly kind of like a spirit or an apparition, kind of whispering into Odysseus' ear. It's kind of implied or suggested maybe she's just a figment of his imagination, that maybe he's just suffering from like severe post-traumatic stress from the Trojan War, and this is just like his own way of trying to wrestle with his own guilty conscience. Because you never see like Mount Olympus and all the gods kind of lined up, and you never hear about Apollo like helping to kill Achilles and that sort of thing. So none of those mythological aspects are really left in, but he does include all the monsters, which is weird. So like, if you're gonna do giant cannibalistic monsters and like fucking Cyclops and Scylla, that six-headed serpent, you might as well go all the way and include all the gods and the titans, etc. and so forth. But that's just my opinion. But I don't think that Christopher Nolan goes home at night and reads fantasy books, or reads like Egyptian mythology or Norse mythology. I don't think he's getting off on the supernatural at all. I have a feeling he's probably reading books like the book that was turned into Oppenheimer, things like that, or stories that were turned into things like Dunkirk. He's a much more kind of grounded scientific guy. And so I don't know if temperamentally or aesthetically he's the best fit for the supernatural, fantasy, or myth.
Bringing it all.
And I'm just having a quick glance at my notes, and I can't believe I've gotten this deep into the video without at least acknowledging some of the various ongoing discussions and debates and controversies surrounding some of the casting decisions for this movie. Here's my suggestion, and it might be an unpopular one, but much like I said earlier, they should have done the entire movie in Homeric Greek. Whatever the version of Greek that was being spoken 2,700 years ago was, they should have gone with that and just used subtitles. When it comes to the cast, they should have gone to Greece and done an open casting call for every single role in the movie. Forget all the movie stars, forget Tom Holland, forget, John Leguizamo. Like, a lot of these movie stars are pretty terrible in the movie to begin with, and they're kind of distracting. So just make everybody Greek. And because Christopher Nolan is the world's most popular, beloved, like successful filmmaker by a very healthy margin, the movie would have been cheaper with no movie stars, probably $50 million cheaper. And people probably still would have gone just for Christopher Nolan. So I feel like it would have been a unique opportunity to discover, some new beautiful actress to be Helena Troy, and some new cool actor to play Odysseus, and some new cool actor to play Athena, whatever the case might be. But I feel like all the casting controversies could have been avoided by just saying, screw it, we're going to cast everybody from the country of Greece, or at least one of the neighboring countries, like anything that's vaguely kind of Mediterranean, whether you have Italian ancestry or if your ancestors are from Slovenia or Turkey or whatever, but something very Mediterranean. I feel like then all the controversies could have been solved. And as I mentioned in my video from my top 10 favorite movies about Greek mythology, there are some movies that have been made in Greece about Greek mythology. And one that seems to be regaining a lot of popularity now because it deals with Agamemnon and the sacrifice he makes in order to create the wind necessary to get his troops to Troy. But Iphigenia, which came out in 1977, basically, he has angered the gods, and they demand that he sacrifice his daughter. And so he lies and says, oh, we're going to marry my daughter to Achilles, bring her on over. And his wife shows up. She's like, well, here she is. He's like, oh, sorry, we're not going to do that because my men will tear me apart if we don't go ahead and sacrifice her, which is why when Agamemnon returns from Troy, his wife is waiting to murder him, which has also been covered in many other classic Greek tragedies. But if you want to see some movies that feel authentically Greek, Iphigenia would be one to start with.
Μίλησαν. Ο βασιλιάς του Άργους Αγαμέμνων πρέπει να θυσιάσει την πρωτότοκη κόρη του, Ιφηγένεια.
But as I scroll through my notes, I just remember there's one more compliment I want to offer to Christopher Nolan, because throughout his entire career, he's loved dabbling with time and time manipulation and time perception, and we see it in Memento, we obviously see it in Inception, we see it in Interstellar, we see it in Tenet, and even in the cross-cutting in Dunkirk between like the different rates of time between like the different points of view of the soldiers. He just loves time dilation, time contraction. It's kind of his thing. But this narrative offers him a unique opportunity to dabble with time, because as you read the original text, oftentimes it's somebody like Odysseus sitting down as somebody's guest and telling them a story. Like, oh, well, this is what happened when we got to this island. This is what happened when we got to that island. But we cross-cut around because like the story begins from Telemachus' point of view as he's looking for news about his father. And then we learn about his father living on the island of Calypso. And actually, Calypso, I liked Calypso in this, played by Charlize Theron. She was not bad as Calypso. She might have been maybe the best female role in here. Some are going to say Anne Hathaway, and she's good as Penelope, but I think of all the female characters, Charlize Theron was probably the most interesting. But because of that innate structure of telling stories in flashback, this movie does allow Christopher Nolan to jump around in the story in ways that probably make him very excited as somebody who likes messing around with time. Also, one last note about female characters. Got a bit of a bone to pick with Lupita Nyong'o in one of the interviews she offered about this text, where she was scolding from her position of great intellectual superiority. She was scolding Homer for not writing enough interesting roles for women in his original text. And I just want to say, Lupita, I don't think you ever read the Odyssey, and you're probably not that familiar with Greek mythology overall, because if there's any fictional setting or series of stories that have an abundance of phenomenal roles for women, it would be Greek mythology. Just within the Odyssey, you've got Athena, you got Penelope, you got Calypso, you've got Circe. You have some really strong female characters who are very well written in the original text without changing a word. But if you look at Greek mythology overall, tons of great stories about Hera, tons of great stories about Artemis, tons of great stories about Athena. It's like they're littered with great stories. Or Pandora, or Persephone, just the list goes on and on and on. So to borrow an expression from Sam Peckinpah, which he said about Pauline Kael, there's some review she offered where he said, oh, well, she's cracking walnuts with her ass. Lupita Nyong'o was cracking walnuts with her ass, which she was condemning Homer for not writing enough interesting roles for women. I just want to say the reason you have a job on this movie is because Homer did write interesting stories for women. So instead, why don't we just say, you know what? Thank you, Homer, for writing a cool story that has endured for all these many years. But just as a way of closing this video up, I want to talk about my revised lists for my all-time favorite Christopher Nolan movies and my all-time favorite Greek mythology movies. And I haven't done a Christopher Nolan ranked video in years leading up to Tenet. I did a top 10 video, but since then we've had Tenet, Oppenheimer, and now the Odyssey. So we've got 13 movies to choose from now. My top 5 Christopher Nolan are probably, well, number one's The Dark Knight, just because I've seen it the greatest number of times. It would be totally dishonest if I were to say any other movie, because I think I saw The Dark Knight like 5 times in the theater. I kept dragging people back to the theater to see it. And I think sometimes film enthusiasts will tie themselves in knots trying to come up with all this sophisticated criteria for ranking movies. But in the end, if you've seen a movie a lot, chances are that's your favorite. But behind that, I would put The Prestige at number 2, Dunkirk at number 3, Inception at number 4. But for number 5, it's not the Odyssey. What would the number 5 be? Maybe Memento, because that was just the movie that made me fall in love with Christopher Nolan's movies in the first place, and I just love the originality of it and the cross-cutting between the story being told in reverse and the story being told sequentially, and the black and white and the color. So those would be my top 5. The big question is, what do I think is his weakest movie? I don't think he's made any bad movies. Christopher Nolan's a remarkable filmmaker, and most great directors have at least one or two stinkers through their name. He just has movies that I like, some of which I like more than others. But the one that I would be least inclined to revisit would probably be his debut feature film, Following. And my second least favorite might be Insomnia, not because I think it's a bad movie. I saw it several times. I just think it's not quite as good as the original movie upon which it was based. It was a remake of, I think, a Norwegian movie. But there are some movies by Nolan where I see them once and then I don't feel compelled to revisit them. Like in Interstellar, saw it once in the theater. I've never seen it from start to finish since. And I know there are a lot of people that regard it as like 2001. They're like, you're crazy. So I do need to see Interstellar again from start to finish. Tenet, I saw twice, but I think the second time I saw it just because I was getting prepared to do a list. But I really only wanted to see it one time. And Oppenheimer, as much as I praised it in 2023 when it came out, and as much as I celebrated it for its great success in terms of Oscars and box office, I have not seen Oppenheimer again since I saw it. So it's like, do I really like Oppenheimer, or did I just like it then? But where does I think the Odyssey is probably going to go right around the middle. It's going to be somewhere around like, number 8 or number 7 in Nolan's career. But I just have too many areas where I'm really, really frustrated with the movie to rank it higher than that. I can watch Batman Begins anytime. I can watch The Dark Knight anytime. Dark Knight Rises only has a couple scenes that I like, but the scenes that I like are really, really good. And so I don't think it's Christopher Nolan's finest hour. But we shall see what the future holds for him. Now, as far as top 10 Greek mythology movies are concerned, as I said repeatedly throughout my videos celebrating my top 10 favorite Greek mythology movies, there are very few Greek mythology movies that I like from start to finish. Actually, there are really none. Like, I have complaints about all of them. Huge surprise. I've got strong opinions about Greek mythology movies, but there's always like scenes or ingredients that I really love that make certain movies climb to the top and others fall out of the list. I think if I were to take the Odyssey and insert it into my top 10 list, I'm going to say something controversial here. I don't rank it higher than The Return, which for me is currently number 6. And even though that movie is slower than hell and at times downright boring, when it gets good at the end, when Odysseus is heating up his bow and getting ready to string it and getting ready to fire the arrow, that scene is performed so perfectly and so emotionally, and it's so overwhelming and so powerful. Like, that entire scene just gives me such euphoria and joy. It kind of pushes all my other considerations aside, and there was not a single scene in the Odyssey where I felt that euphoria and joy, which is what I was craving with this movie. I wanted to see one scene where I was like, Greek mythology, woo! Like, where I could get really pumped up. Movies like Jason and the Argonauts have it. Movies like Ulysses have it. Movies like Troy, and Troy is deeply flawed. We can start with the fact that they kill Menelaus in the movie, and they don't even pronounce his name right. They call him Menelaus throughout all of Troy. But there are other scenes in that movie which are fucking fantastic. So Troy is my number 3. But the Odyssey, I'm going to rearrange my Greek mythology list, and I'll put it in at number 7, which would bump Helen of Troy back to 8, and the other Helen of Troy from 1924 back to 9, and Iphigenia back to 10. And sorry, Steve Reeves, I guess your Hercules movies get dropped out as well. But like Steve Reeves, I just like his build, and I like his great scenes where he's like, bending chains and doing all that stuff. But when it comes to adaptations, those movies might as well be fan fiction in many cases. So yeah, The Odyssey, it's in the top 10, but it's not a movie that I can see myself falling in love with and seeing many times and calling up my friends and family members and saying, we have got to go see The Odyssey. You must see it while it's still in the theater. I think if you want to see The Odyssey, go see The Odyssey, but I'm not going to drag anybody by their hair against their will to see it unless they're just jumping out of their skin. And the big question is, if I don't find a wingman who wants to go again, I don't know if I'll see it in the theater for another, like a second time or not. But the movie certainly has its moments. And anytime the world's greatest filmmaker decides to make like a $250 million R-rated mythological historical epic, I'm always going to approve the attempt and get behind the attempt. It's one of the things where I would love it if every year we had some big, giant R-rated mythological extravaganza like that to get behind. And these movies are incredibly rare, but I don't want to fall into the trap of applauding and cheering for what it represents versus what it actually is, especially when I have so many grievances against so many details throughout the movie. But the big question as far as 2026 is concerned is, will it be better than or worse than Dune Part 3? Because Dune Part 3 I'm very fired up for. And I think my gut tells me it's going to be a better movie than the Odyssey. But it does take a lot of liberties with the source material, Dune Messiah, which means that movie has a lot of rope to hang itself with. So the game is afoot. If Denis Villeneuve and Christopher Nolan are like our two biggest filmmakers when it comes to big budget, kind of auteur-driven franchise films for the big studios, well then there's no better way to measure their strengths and weaknesses and where they stand in the overall kind of movie landscape than pitting two of their most ambitious movies against one another later this year. So I look forward to that discussion at the end of the year. But I think at this point, I've said enough about the Odyssey. Hope you enjoyed my point of view. If so, remember to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, become a member, all that good stuff. Hope everybody has a great weekend at the movies, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.